April 1945. Guam, 3 weeks before victory in Europe, and 4 months before atomic bombs would end the Pacific War. Captain James Raymond. Mitchell stood on the flight line at North Field, watching his crew perform pre-flight checks on their Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the massive 4-engine bomber that represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology and the instrument through which the United States intended to bring Japan to its knees through systematic destruction of its industrial cities and military infrastructure. The 26-year-old pilot from rural Oklahoma had completed 14 combat missions over Japan, each one a grueling 15-hour ordeal that tested both the aircraft's capabilities and the crew's endurance as they flew through flak and fighter opposition to drop their payloads on targets that intelligence assured them were critical to Japan's continued war-making capacity. Mitchell's B-29, officially designated 42-63214, but known to the crew as Thunder Run, after the Oklahoma storms that had shaped Mitchell's childhood, had performed flawlessly through those 14 missions despite the notorious reputation of the Wright R-3350, engines that powered all B-29s, and which had earned the sardonic nickname Wrong Engines among crews who knew that engine fires represented the single greatest threat to their survival, more dangerous than Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire, because fires could not be outmaneuvered or avoided through tactical flying. Around Mitchell gathered the 10 other men who comprised Thunder Run's crew, young Americans mostly, the oldest being 32-year-old flight engineer Master Sergeant Carl Hendricks, who had worked as an aviation mechanic before the war and whose encyclopedic knowledge of the B-29's complex systems had already saved the crew on multiple occasions when mechanical problems threatened to abort missions or worse. The co-pilot, First Lieutenant David Chen, represented the increasingly diverse nature of American military service, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown who had faced discrimination and suspicion following Pearl Harbor, but who had nevertheless volunteered for service and proven himself an exceptionally skilled aviator, whose calm demeanor under pressure complemented Mitchell's more aggressive flying style. The rest of the crew consisted of specialists whose functions reflected the technological sophistication that made the B-29 the most advanced bomber ever built, including Bombardier Lieutenant Robert Walsh, who operated the complex Norden bombsight that theoretically allowed precision targeting from high altitude, Navigator Lieutenant Thomas Kowalski, whose celestial navigation and dead reckoning skills were essential for missions that covered thousands of miles of open ocean, Radio Operator Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien, whose communications equipment kept the aircraft connected to base and coordinated with the larger bombing formations, Radar Operator Technical Sergeant James Liu, who operated the revolutionary airborne radar that allowed bombing through cloud cover, and 5 gunners who manned the remote-controlled turrets and tailgun that defended against Japanese fighter attacks. Mission number 87 called for Thunder Run, and 49 other B-29s from the 313th Bombardment Wing to strike industrial targets in Osaka, Japan's second-largest city and a major manufacturing center whose destruction would further cripple Japan's ability to produce the weapons and equipment necessary to continue the war that American military planners knew was approaching its final stages despite fanatical Japanese resistance that suggested the invasion of the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. The mission briefing had emphasized the importance of this particular raid, explaining that Osaka's factories produced everything from aircraft components to naval equipment, and that eliminating these production facilities would weaken Japan's already desperate strategic position and potentially hasten the surrender that would save countless lives on both sides by avoiding the necessity of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan that military estimates suggested could result in over 1 million Allied casualties. The B-29 Superfortress that Mitchell and his crew would fly into combat represented an almost incomprehensible investment of American industrial and technological capability, a weapons system whose development had cost over $3 billion, exceeding even the Manhattan Project's budget for developing atomic weapons, making it the single most expensive military program of World War II and a testament to America's determination to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean in ways that no previous military force in human history had ever attempted. Designed by Boeing in response to Army Air Force's requirements for a pressurized high-altitude bomber capable of carrying substantial bomb loads over ranges exceeding 3,000 miles, the B-29 incorporated innovations that pushed the boundaries of 1940s aviation technology, including a pressurized cabin that allowed crew members to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks or electrically heated suits, remotely controlled gun turrets that could be aimed through computerized fire control systems by gunners seated inside the pressurized fuselage rather than exposed to wind and cold in traditional gun positions. Reversible pitch propellers that could reverse thrust to shorten landing distances, and an advanced autopilot system that reduced pilot workload during the long missions that characterized Pacific operations. The aircraft measured 99 feet in length with a wingspan of 141 feet and stood nearly 30 feet tall, weighing over 70,000 pounds empty and capable of carrying maximum loaded weights exceeding 140,000 pounds when fully fueled and armed, figures that seemed almost absurd for an aircraft that nevertheless possessed the grace and performance characteristics necessary for the high-altitude bombing missions that strategic doctrine demanded. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each producing over 2,200 horsepower through 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows and driving massive 4-bladed propellers, provided the thrust necessary to lift these enormous bombers into the sky and maintain cruise speeds around 300 miles per hour at altitudes where thin air and extreme cold created operating conditions that stressed every system on the aircraft. But these engines, magnificent achievements of engineering that they were, suffered from fundamental design flaws that would never be completely resolved during wartime production. Flaws that manifested primarily as a terrifying tendency to overheat during the high-power settings required for takeoff and climb, creating conditions where magnesium components in the engine cowlings and accessories could ignite and burn with intense white-hot flames that could quickly spread to fuel lines and wing structures, transforming the aircraft into a flying inferno from which escape was difficult and survival uncertain. B-29 crews developed a dark joke that more of them were being killed by Curtiss-Wright, the manufacturer of the engines, than by the Japanese, and statistics suggested the joke contained uncomfortable truth, since operational losses from engine fires and mechanical failures exceeded combat losses from enemy action by nearly 2 to 1, meaning that for every B-29 shot down by Japanese defenses, almost 2 more were lost to accidents and mechanical problems that reflected the rushed development and production schedules that prioritized getting aircraft into combat over perfecting systems that might have saved hundreds of American lives. Mitchell understood these risks intimately, had witnessed B-29s explode during takeoff when engines caught fire before the aircraft could gain sufficient altitude for crew bailout, had seen bombers trailing flames limp back to base, only to crash short of the runway when structural failure made controlled flight impossible, had attended memorial services for crews who simply disappeared over the Pacific when catastrophic mechanical failures occurred beyond range of rescue aircraft or surface vessels that might have saved survivors from the ocean that claimed so many young Americans during the war against Japan. The pre-flight inspection that Mitchell conducted with Sergeant Hendricks focused particular attention on the engines, both men understanding that careful scrutiny before flight represented their best defense against the catastrophic failures that could transform routine missions into desperate struggles for survival thousands of miles from the relative safety of their Guam airbase. They examined each engine's cowling for signs of oil leaks or metal fatigue, checked that cooling flaps operated smoothly and that magnetos produced proper spark, verified that propeller feathering mechanisms functioned correctly so that failed engines could be isolated and their propellers turned edge-on to the slipstream to reduce drag, inspected fuel lines for cracks or loose fittings that might spray volatile aviation gasoline onto hot engine components, and satisfied themselves that all 4 Wright R-3350s appeared ready to perform the demanding mission ahead, despite their notorious unreliability. Mitchell signed the aircraft acceptance forms that officially transferred responsibility for the bomber from ground crew to flight crew. A bureaucratic ritual that nevertheless carried weight, because it meant that whatever happened during the next 15 hours would be his responsibility. His decisions would determine whether his crew returned safely or joined the growing list of casualties that the air war against Japan consumed with remorseless efficiency. Takeoff was scheduled for 1400 hours, timed so that the formation would arrive over Osaka after sunset, when darkness would provide some protection from Japanese fighters and make anti-aircraft targeting more difficult, though it also meant that any aircraft damaged during the raid would face the nightmare scenario of returning across hundreds of miles of open ocean in darkness with navigation depending entirely on dead reckoning and celestial observations, complicated by battle damage and crew fatigue. The crew boarded Thunder Run through the forward hatch, each man moving to his designated station in the pressurized fuselage or unpressurized tail section, running through individual pre-flight checks that verified equipment functionality and prepared them for the mission ahead. Mitchell settled into the left seat of the cockpit, Chen occupying the right seat beside him, and together they began the checklist that would transform this inert aluminum and steel machine into a functioning bomber capable of the mission they had been assigned. The four Wright R-3350 engines started with characteristic clouds of blue smoke, as accumulated oil in the lower cylinders burned off, then settled into the deep rumble that signified proper operation. All gauges showing normal temperatures and pressures that suggested the engines were ready for the demanding work ahead. Mitchell advanced throttles and released brakes, steering Thunder Run onto the taxiway that led to Northfield's main runway, where other B-29s were already positioning for takeoff, the entire formation preparing to launch in carefully timed sequence that would allow them to assemble into the defensive boxes that provided mutual protection through overlapping fields of fire from their combined gun turrets. The tower cleared Thunder Run for takeoff, and Mitchell aligned the bomber on the runway centerline, advancing throttles to maximum power and feeling the massive aircraft slowly accelerate as 35 tons of metal and fuel and bombs gathered momentum, the airspeed indicator climbing through 50 knots, 60, 70, approaching the 130 miles per hour necessary for liftoff from the coral-surfaced runway that had been bulldozed across Guam's tropical landscape specifically to support B-29 operations against Japan. The flight to Japan proceeded normally for the first 8 hours, Thunder Run maintaining position in the formation. As they crossed endless expanses of Pacific Ocean where survival depended entirely on the aircraft's ability to stay airborne, because ditching meant probable death from exposure or drowning or shark attack in waters where rescue was unlikely, and where Japanese submarines still prowled despite their Navy's general defeat. Chen handled most of the flying during the cruise phase, allowing Mitchell to rest and conserve energy for the demanding work that would begin when they approached the target area where Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire would contest their presence and where split-second decisions might determine whether they completed the mission and survived to return home. The crew fell into routines developed through 14 previous missions, gunners scanning their sectors for enemy aircraft that might attempt interception, Navigator Kowalski updating position, estimates based on celestial observations and dead reckoning calculations, radio operator O'Brien monitoring communications frequencies for updates from formation leaders or warnings about Japanese fighter activity, everyone maintaining the professional alertness that combat required while managing the fatigue that accumulated during missions lasting most of a day and night. As sunset approached and the formation began its final approach to the Japanese coast, tension increased throughout the aircraft because this phase of the mission historically produced the highest casualties. Where anti-aircraft batteries concentrated around major cities would fill the sky with exploding shells, designed to destroy bombers or at minimum damage them enough that they fell out of formation and became easy targets for fighter attacks. Mitchell resumed control from Chen, his hands on the yoke and throttles as Thunder Run crossed the coastline, and Japanese searchlights began probing the darkening sky while anti-aircraft fire erupted in orange, bursts that created turbulence even when the shells exploded hundreds of yards away. The formation maintained altitude at 26,000 feet, high enough to make Japanese fighter interception, more difficult but low enough that bombing accuracy could be maintained, despite the limitations of the Norden bomb sight that performed less effectively at extreme altitudes, where thin air and wind drift made precision targeting nearly impossible. The initial bomb run proceeded, according to plan, with Walsh, the bombardier, taking control of the aircraft through the linked autopilot that allowed the Norden sight to make final course corrections during the critical seconds before bomb release, and Thunder Run held steady, despite buffeting from nearby flak bursts, while Walsh called out range to target and made final adjustments that would theoretically place their bombs on the assigned industrial facility whose destruction represented this mission's primary objective, the moment that would transform a routine, if dangerous, combat mission into a desperate fight for survival came, without warning, at exactly 19:42 hours, when Thunder Run was still 2 minutes from bomb release. The No. 2 engine on the port wing suddenly erupting in flames that immediately spread across the cowling and began consuming the magnesium components that burned with terrible intensity once ignited. Mitchell saw the fire from his peripheral vision, a bright orange glow that rapidly expanded into a conflagration that threatened to consume the entire wing, and his training took over as he simultaneously feathered the No. 2 propeller to stop its rotation and reduce drag, activated the engine's fire suppression system that dumped carbon dioxide into the cowling in an attempt to smother the flames, and began the engine shutdown checklist that Hendricks called out from his position at the flight engineer's panel, where dozens of gauges monitored every system on the aircraft. The fire suppression system, which had successfully extinguished engine fires on previous missions, proved ineffective against flames that had already compromised fuel lines and were being fed by the 100-octane aviation gasoline that sprayed from ruptured connections, and within 30 seconds the fire had burned through the cowling and was spreading to the wing structure, where it threatened to weaken the main spar that gave the wing its structural integrity, and without which catastrophic failure would cause the entire wing to separate from the fuselage, dooming everyone aboard. Chen immediately radioed the formation leader that Thunder Run had an engine fire and was aborting the mission, while Mitchell fought to maintain control as flames streamed back from the burning engine and created tremendous drag that wanted to roll the aircraft into the dead engine, forcing him to apply opposite aileron and rudder in amounts that made his legs and arms ache from the physical effort of keeping the bomber straight and level. Walsh abandoned the bomb run and salvoed the payload, 8 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs that tumbled away into the darkness below, removing weight that would be critical for the emergency that was rapidly developing from bad to catastrophic. Hendricks reported from his engineer's panel that fuel pressure was dropping in all engines, suggesting that the fire had damaged crossfeed lines and that they would soon lose the ability to transfer fuel between tanks. And then came the news that transformed crisis into potential disaster, when the No. 1 engine, immediately adjacent to the burning No. 2, began showing temperature spikes that indicated fire had spread through the shared nacelle structures and that they were now facing a situation where 2 engines on the same wing were compromised and where loss of both would make controlled flight virtually impossible, given the asymmetric thrust from the 2 remaining engines on the starboard wing. Mitchell's immediate response to the spreading fire demonstrated the combination of training and instinct that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, as he recognized within seconds that conventional emergency procedures would be inadequate for the crisis rapidly developing on Thunder Run's port wing, and that survival would require decisions that violated established protocols and pushed both aircraft and crew to the absolute limits of what was theoretically possible. The No. 1 engine's temperature gauges climbed into the red zone, even as Hendricks confirmed from his engineer's panel that fire had indeed spread through the shared structure between engines 1 and 2, that fire suppression systems designed to handle single-engine fires were overwhelmed by flames consuming 2 adjacent power plants simultaneously, and that they faced the very real possibility of catastrophic wing failure if fire burned through the main spar that provided structural integrity necessary for the wing to remain attached to the fuselage under the tremendous loads that flight imposed on airframe components. Mitchell made the agonizing decision to shut down and feather the #1 engine, despite knowing that this would leave Thunder Run with only 2 functioning engines, both on the starboard wing, creating an asymmetric thrust situation that would make the bomber almost uncontrollable and would certainly make it impossible to maintain altitude with the added weight of fuel and the drag from the dead engines and the burned and distorted cowlings that increased resistance and reduced the aircraft's already marginal aerodynamic efficiency. As the #1 propeller stopped rotating and its blades turned edge-on to the slipstream, the fire on that engine began to diminish for lack of the airflow that had been feeding flames. But the #2 engine continued burning with undiminished intensity, flames streaming back along the wing surface and creating a terrifying orange glow that illuminated the night sky and announced Thunder Run's distress to every Japanese fighter and anti-aircraft battery within visual range. Chen maintained continuous radio communication with the formation leader and with other B-29s in the strike force, informing them that Thunder Run was descending out of formation and heading for emergency ditching coordinates, where submarines and surface vessels maintained stations specifically to rescue downed aircrews, while Mitchell struggled to maintain control as the bomber wanted to roll continuously toward the dead engines and required maximum opposite aileron and rudder input just to maintain relatively straight flight, his arms and legs already aching from the physical effort, and his mind calculating that he lacked the strength to maintain these control inputs for the hours it would take to reach potential ditching sites, hundreds of miles from their current position over Japan. The crew prepared for ditching according to established procedures, with Walsh and Kowalski destroying classified materials and codes that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands, gunners abandoning their positions and moving to crash positions near the main spar, where structural strength was greatest and survival probability highest. Radio operator O'Brien transmitting continuous distress signals with their position and heading so that rescue forces would know where to search for survivors. Everyone understanding that ditching a B-29 at night, in rough Pacific seas with fires still burning, represented almost certain death for at least some of the crew and probable death for all of them, given the aircraft's tendency to break upon water impact and sink rapidly before crew could escape through hatches that might be jammed or blocked by wreckage. Mitchell knew that ditching Thunder Run meant condemning his crew to survival odds that he found unacceptable. Knew that even if they survived the impact and managed to escape the sinking aircraft before it dragged them down to depths where pressure would crush their bodies, they would face exposure to cold water that would kill within hours, or sharks that patrolled these waters and attacked with horrifying efficiency, or Japanese vessels that might rescue them, only to subject them to the brutal treatment that characterized Japanese handling of American prisoners who often faced torture and execution rather than the protection that international law theoretically guaranteed. As he fought to maintain control of the crippled bomber and calculated their diminishing options, a possibility occurred to him that was so audacious and apparently suicidal that he initially dismissed it before reconsidering with the desperate logic of a man who understood that conventional solutions would certainly result in death while unconventionalness solutions offered at least the possibility of survival even if the odds seemed impossibly long. Iwo Jima, the tiny volcanic island that American forces had captured just 2 months earlier at horrific cost in one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles, lay approximately 800 miles southeast of their current position, a distance that would normally be easily manageable for a B-29, but which seemed impossible for an aircraft, with only 2 functioning engines both on the same wing, creating control problems that made sustained flight questionable. But Iwo Jima represented the only substantial land between Thunder Run's current position and the Marianas bases over 1,500 miles away, offered emergency runways specifically constructed to handle damaged B-29s returning from missions over Japan, provided medical facilities and repair capabilities that might save both crew and aircraft, made survival possible rather than merely theoretical if they could somehow cover 800 miles and maintain enough control to attempt landing rather than crashing in flames that would kill everyone aboard. Mitchell announced his decision to attempt reaching Iwo Jima, a pronouncement that Chen initially questioned and that Hendricks flatly stated was impossible, given their fuel consumption with only 2 engines. their inability to maintain altitude that would put them increasingly lower and more vulnerable to wave impact if they lost additional power. Their control problems that would only worsen with crew fatigue during the hours necessary to cover the distance. And the continued fire on the number 2 engine that showed no signs of extinguishing and threatened to burn through critical structures at any moment. But Mitchell had made his decision with the certainty that characterized his command style. Informed Chen that they would proceed toward Iwo Jima and that the co-pilot should calculate the course and estimated fuel requirements, told Hendricks to determine whether they could jettison additional weight to improve their performance and extend their range, instructed Walsh to verify exact coordinates for Iwo Jima's emergency runways and radio frequencies for approach control, ordered O'Brien to transmit their intentions to rescue coordination centers and to the Iwo Jima control tower so that emergency equipment would be standing by for their arrival, assigned Kowalski the task of calculating optimal altitude profiles that would balance fuel conservation against the need to maintain enough height that loss of another engine wouldn't immediately force ditching, mobilized his crew toward action rather than passive acceptance of fate that conventional wisdom suggested they should embrace. The flight toward Iwo Jima became an endurance test that pushed aircraft and crew beyond limits that training and doctrine claimed were absolute, revealing that human determination and engineering margins could combine to achieve results that calculations suggested were impossible when the alternative was certain death and when individuals decided that survival justified risks that would be unconscionable under less desperate circumstances. The fire on the number 2 engine continued burning for another 40 minutes before finally consuming all available fuel in damaged lines and self-extinguishing, leaving a blackened and distorted cowling that created substantial drag but at least no longer, threatened to burn through wing structures and cause catastrophic failure that would send Thunder Run tumbling from the sky in pieces that would scatter across miles of dark Pacific Ocean where no one would ever find evidence of their final moments. Mitchell and Chen alternated control of the aircraft every 30 minutes because the physical effort required to maintain relatively straight flight against the asymmetric thrust exhausted them both, their arms and legs cramping from the constant pressure necessary to hold aileron and rudder against the bomber's persistent tendency to roll and yaw toward the dead port engines, their hands developing blisters from gripping controls with the intensity necessary to prevent the momentary relaxation that would send Thunder Run into an unrecoverable spiral that would kill them before they could regain control. Hendricks monitored fuel consumption with obsessive attention, calculating and recalculating their remaining range against the distance to Iwo Jima, initially concluding that they would run dry 50 miles short of the island before revising his estimate upward as Mitchell established a cruise regime that minimized fuel burn even at the cost of maintaining altitude that steadily decreased from their initial 26,000 feet down to 20,000, then 15,000, then 10,000 as hours passed and the bomber descended in a gradual, controlled descent that represented compromise between fuel conservation and maintaining enough altitude that catastrophic engine failure wouldn't immediately doom them. The crew dealt with their fear through the black humor that characterized military personnel confronting mortality, with Gunner Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez joking that at least they wouldn't have to worry about Japanese fighters at night and radar operator Liu responding that the Japanese probably didn't need to waste ammunition when Thunder Run would crash on its own without their assistance, dark jokes that released tension and maintained morale during hours when terror might have overwhelmed men with more time to contemplate their probable deaths. Navigation became increasingly critical as they proceeded, south and east across dark ocean where there were no visual references and where their survival depended entirely on Kowalski's ability to maintain accurate dead reckoning. Despite the impossible conditions under which he worked, calculating wind drift and ground speed and course corrections, using instruments that were designed for normal flight rather than for crippled aircraft barely maintaining controlled flight, occasionally obtaining celestial fixes when stars were visible, through gaps in scattered clouds, but mostly depending on estimates and calculations that accumulated errors with every passing hour and which might easily result in their missing Iwo Jima entirely, and flying past the tiny island into empty ocean, where they would inevitably ditch when exhausted, and where no rescue forces would find them. Before exposure and sharks eliminated whatever, survivors emerged from the ditching. 4 hours and 37 minutes after the initial engine fire, with fuel gauges showing levels that Hendricks calculated gave them perhaps 15 more minutes of flight time. Before the engines quit from fuel starvation, Kowalski announced that his navigation suggested they should be approaching Iwo Jima, and that everyone should watch for the island's lights or any visual confirmation of landfall that might save them from the death that statistics and engineering calculations insisted was inevitable. Chen had been attempting radio contact with Iwo Jima Tower for over an hour without response, either because their radio had been damaged by fire or because atmospheric conditions prevented signal transmission, or simply because tower operators weren't monitoring the emergency frequency with sufficient attention to hear the increasingly desperate calls from a crippled B-29 that was either approaching their island or had already missed it and was flying to oblivion. Mitchell maintained Thunder Run at 7,000 feet, having descended from their original cruise altitude to conserve fuel but maintaining enough height that he had options if they actually found Iwo Jima. Though those options were severely limited by his control problems and by the reality that landing a B-29 with only 2 engines both on the same wing had never been attempted in training and was considered theoretically impossible by engineering authorities who designed the aircraft. Walsh, positioned in the bombardier's compartment in the aircraft's nose where visibility was best, suddenly shouted that he could see lights ahead and slightly to port, lights that had to be Iwo Jima, because there was no other landmass within hundreds of miles, lights that represented salvation if Mitchell could maintain control long enough to reach the island and attempt the landing that would either save them or kill them in a fireball that would at least be mercifully quick compared to the slow death that ditching offered. Mitchell adjusted course toward the lights that gradually resolved into the distinctive pattern of Iwo Jima's runway lighting, the emergency strips that had been carved from volcanic rock and coral, specifically to save B-29 crews exactly like his own. And as they approached the island, he faced the critical decision of whether to attempt landing immediately with the fuel they had remaining, or to circle and burn additional precious gasoline while establishing a proper approach that would give him better odds of successful touchdown. Hendricks made the decision for him by announcing that fuel pressure was fluctuating in both operating engines, indicating that tanks were nearly empty, and that attempting to circle would almost certainly result in engine failure on final approach when they would be too low and too slow to recover, meaning that their only option was to commit to landing immediately, accepting whatever approach geometry they happened to have when they reached the island, trusting that Mitchell's skill and Thunder Run's engineering margins would somehow combine to achieve the impossible landing that represented their only hope for survival. The approach to Iwo Jima's emergency runway became an exercise in controlled desperation as Mitchell descended Thunder Run from 7,000 feet to the pattern altitude of 1,500 feet while simultaneously trying to align with the runway that appeared impossibly small from the air, a narrow strip carved from hostile volcanic landscape that offered no margin for error and no possibility of go-around if the initial landing attempt failed because they lacked fuel for additional maneuvering. The asymmetric thrust from the 2 operating starboard engines created continuous tendency for Thunder Run to roll left, requiring Mitchell to maintain opposite aileron and rudder that his exhausted muscles barely provided, and as he reduced power for descent, the control problems actually worsened because he lost the slipstream effects over control surfaces that had been helping him maintain some degree of directivity despite the impossible thrust situation. Chen called out airspeed and altitude with mechanical precision while his hands hovered near the controls, ready to assist if Mitchell needed help. Though both men understood that this landing would require single pilot precision because any confusion about who had control or any hesitation in control inputs might send them crashing into Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape, instead of safely onto the runway, Mitchell configured Thunder Run for landing by extending flaps incrementally, each notch of flap creating additional drag that required power adjustments from the two remaining engines, and each power adjustment creating thrust changes that affected his already marginal control of the aircraft, forcing him to constantly adjust his aileron and rudder inputs to compensate for the changing flight characteristics as the bomber transitioned from cruise configuration to landing configuration. He extended the landing gear at 500 feet and felt the additional drag immediately. The gear doors opening and the massive main gear assemblies extending into the slipstream and creating so much resistance that Thunder Run's descent rate increased dangerously, and Mitchell had to add power from the two operating engines to prevent sinking below the glide path. But adding power made the control problems worse because increased thrust from the starboard engines created even more asymmetric forces trying to roll the aircraft into the dead port engines. The runway appeared through the windscreen as a narrow strip of lights that seemed impossibly short and dangerously narrow. Designed for emergency landings, but still requiring precise pilot technique to touch down within the usable portion rather than undershooting into the volcanic rocks before the runway or overshooting into the terrain beyond where damaged. B-29s sometimes crashed when pilots couldn't stop within available distance. Mitchell established what he hoped was a stable descent profile. Thunder Run descending toward the runway at roughly 700 feet per minute with airspeed, maintained at 140 miles per hour, slightly faster than normal approach speed, because he feared that slower speeds might make the bomber uncontrollable, given his asymmetric thrust situation. Accepting that the faster touchdown would require more runway to stop, but judging that control took precedence over landing distance when the alternative was losing control on short final and crashing in flames that would kill his entire crew after they had survived so much. The touchdown occurred at precisely 0118 hours on April 29th, 1945, when Thunder Run's main gear contacted Iwo Jima's emergency runway with an impact that was harder than normal because Mitchell's faster approach speed and the aircraft's heavy weight combined to create forces that compressed the landing gear struts to their limits and sent a shudder through the entire airframe that suggested structural damage, but which also meant they were on the ground and still alive. Mitchell immediately reduced throttles on the two operating engines to idle and applied brakes with maximum pressure, feeling Thunder Run shudder and slow, as brake friction converted kinetic energy to heat that made the brake assemblies glow red in the darkness. The massive bomber requiring every foot of the runway's 8,000-foot length before finally rolling to a stop less than 200 feet from the end where volcanic rock would have destroyed the aircraft and killed everyone aboard if their touchdown point had been even slightly farther down the runway. The crew sat in stunned silence for perhaps 10 seconds before someone began laughing, a sound that was partly relief and partly hysteria, and partly the recognition that they had just accomplished something that aeronautical engineers claimed was impossible, landing a heavily loaded B-29, using only two engines both mounted on the same wing after flying 800 miles with major fire damage and control problems. That should have made even straight and level flight impossible, much less a precision instrument approach and landing at night on an unfamiliar runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded Thunder Run within minutes, fire crews standing ready with foam and water in case residual fires erupted, ambulances positioning to evacuate any injured crew members, FANG's personnel staring at the burned and damaged bomber, with expressions suggesting they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. A B-29 that appeared to have been partially consumed by fire and which should, by all rights, be scattered across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean, rather than sitting on their runway with crew emerging through hatches and kissing the volcanic ground and celebrating survival that seemed miraculous even to men who had witnessed numerous emergency landings during their months operating Iwo Jima's facilities. Mitchell climbed down from the cockpit on legs that shook from exhaustion and cramped muscles, his hands blistered and bleeding from hours gripping controls with desperate intensity, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the relatively cool night air, and he stood looking at Thunder Run's damaged port wing, where the No. 2 engine's cowling appeared, partially melted, and where fire had blackened wing surfaces and consumed paint and created distortions in metal that suggested how close they had come to catastrophic structural failure. An Air Force major approached and introduced himself as the base operations officer, asking Mitchell how he had managed to land with only 2 engines both on the same wing, a feat that the Major stated he had never seen attempted, and which engineering doctrine claimed was impossible given the control problems and performance limitations that such configuration created. And Mitchell responded with characteristic understatement that he hadn't known it was impossible, and that not knowing had probably helped him accomplish what training and doctrine insisted couldn't be done. The crew spent 3 days on Iwo Jima, while maintenance personnel assessed Thunder Run's damage and determined that the bomber could be repaired, though it would require weeks of work to replace the burned engines and repair fire damage to wing structures and control systems. And during those 3 days, Mitchell and his men became minor celebrities among the base. Personnel who had witnessed numerous B-29 emergency landings but had never seen anything comparable to Thunder Run's arrival with half its engines destroyed and control problems that should have doomed the aircraft and crew long before they reached the island. The base commander recommended Mitchell for the Distinguished Flying Cross, citing his exceptional piloting skill and decision-making that had saved his crew and preserved a valuable aircraft that might otherwise have been lost. And while Mitchell accepted the decoration with appropriate humility, he privately acknowledged that survival had depended as much on luck and engineering margins as on skill. The dozens of decisions by Boeing engineers and Wright engine designers and countless factory workers who had built Thunder Run's components had contributed to their survival as much as his piloting had, that the medal recognized one man, but represented the collective effort of thousands who had created the B-29 program and who had built safeguards and redundancies that allowed aircraft to survive damage that would have destroyed lesser machines